The snow had buried the valley under 4 feet of white by the time February reached its bitter end in 1853, and while the other settlers of Broken Creek huddled around their dying fires and watched their woodpiles shrink to nothing, Elias Croft walked barefoot across his cabin floor in nothing but his union suit. His neighbors had called him a fool. They had laughed at his trenches. They had shaken their heads and whispered that the strange man from back east had finally lost whatever sense God gave him when he started digging holes beneath his own home like some kind of deranged prairie dog. But now, with the worst winter in 20 years grinding the settlement toward starvation and the temperature outside dropping to 30 below zero, Elias Croft stood in the warmest building in 300 miles. The stones beneath his feet held heat like a mother holds a child, and the air inside his cabin sat at a comfortable 62 degrees, even though he had not fed his fire in over 6 hours. His smoke tunnel, that ridiculous ditch his neighbors had mocked for an entire summer, ran 47 feet beneath his floor from the fire pit at one end to the exhaust chimney at the other, and every inch of that stone-lined channel worked exactly as he had promised it would. The smoke from his small fire traveled through that underground passage, surrendering its heat to the rocks that surrounded it, and those rocks passed that warmth up through his floor stones throughout the day and deep into the night. Elias had burned less than half the wood his neighbors had burned, and yet his home stayed warmer longer. He had survived what they could not survive. He had proven what they said could not be proven, and before this winter ended, every last one of them would come to his door begging to understand what they had been too proud to learn. But that victory had cost him more than anyone knew. 11 months earlier, the wagon that carried Elias Croft into Broken Creek looked like it had been dragged through every disaster between Pennsylvania and the Oregon Territory. The canvas top had torn in 3 places. The left rear wheel wobbled on a cracked axle held together with rope and prayer, and the man who climbed down from the driver's bench moved with the careful stiffness of someone who had spent too many weeks sitting in one position while the world bounced beneath him. "Another one," a voice said from the porch of the general store. Elias turned toward the sound. A large man with red suspenders and a belly that strained against his shirt buttons stood watching with his arms crossed. 2 other men flanked him, both thinner, both younger, both wearing the same expression of amused contempt. "You lost?" the large man called out. "Settlement's full up. No room for more mouths." Elias pulled his hat from his head and wiped the dust from his brow with his sleeve. "I'm not looking for charity. I purchased a claim from the territory office in Portland, 40 acres along the North Ridge." The large man laughed. It was not a friendly sound. "North Ridge? That rock pile? Son, whoever sold you that claim saw you coming from a mile away. Nothing grows up there. Nothing lives up there. You will freeze solid by Christmas." "Then I will be sure to invite you to my funeral," Elias said. He did not smile. He did not look away. He simply held the large man's gaze until the silence grew uncomfortable. The large man's name was Horace Bickle. He owned the general store, the only mill within 50 miles, and the loyalty of most men in Broken Creek through a combination of credit extended and debts collected. He had arrived in the valley 8 years earlier with nothing but ambition, and he had built his small empire by understanding one simple truth. In a place this remote, the man who controlled the supplies controlled everything. He did not like strangers. He especially did not like strangers who refused to show proper respect. "Name's Bickle," he said, stepping down from the porch. "I run things around here. You need tools, lumber, flour, seed, anything at all, you come to me. Credit terms are fair but firm. Miss a payment, I take collateral. Miss 2 payments, I take your claim." Elias nodded slowly. "And if I do not need credit?" Bickle's eyes narrowed. "Everyone needs credit their first year. Land needs clearing, cabin needs building. Winter comes fast in these mountains. You cannot do it all alone, and you cannot do it without supplies you have not got the money to buy outright. I have money. How much? Elias reached into his coat and produced a leather wallet. He opened it and showed Bickle the bills inside. It was more cash than most men in Broken Creek had seen in one place since they left civilization behind. Bickle's expression shifted. The contempt remained, but something else crept in beside it, something that looked almost like hunger. Well now, a man of means. What brings a man of means to a rock pile in the middle of nowhere? I'm looking for quiet, Elias said. And I am looking for a place where a man can build something without interference. Build what? Elias tucked the wallet back into his coat. Something that works. He climbed back onto his wagon seat, released the brake, and urged his tired horse forward. The wagon creaked and groaned up the main street of Broken Creek, past the dozen rough cabins that made up the settlement, past the half-built church with its crooked steeple, past the cemetery where 7 wooden crosses marked the graves of those who had not survived their first winter. Elias noted every detail, the gaps between the cabin logs where the chinking had cracked and fallen away, the smoke rising from chimneys already working hard, even though spring had barely ended, the stacks of firewood behind each home, some tall and well-organized, others pitifully small. He noted the direction of the wind, the angle of the sun, the way the land rose toward the north ridge where his claim waited. He noted everything, because Elias Croft was not merely a man seeking a new start in a new land. He was an engineer. He was an inventor. And he had come to Broken Creek to prove a theory that had gotten him laughed out of every drawing room and lecture hall back east. The North Ridge claim sat exactly where Bickle had described it, a 40-acre stretch of rocky ground that sloped up toward the mountains like a frozen wave. The soil, where soil existed at all, lay thin over beds of granite and shale. The trees grew sparse and twisted by the wind. A small creek ran along the eastern boundary, but it looked more like a trickle than a reliable water source. By any reasonable measure, the claim was worthless. No farmer would want it. No rancher could use it. The territory office had sold it cheap because no one else had been foolish enough to buy it. But Elias had not come to farm. He had not come to ranch. He had come for the rocks. He spent his first 3 days on the claim doing nothing but walking. He walked the boundaries. He walked the slopes. He walked the creek bed and the tree line and the bare patches where the granite pushed through the earth like the bones of some buried giant. He carried a notebook and a pencil, and he filled page after page with measurements and sketches and calculations that would have meant nothing to anyone watching. On the 4th day, he selected his building site, a relatively flat stretch near the creek, sheltered from the north wind by a natural rise in the terrain with a south-facing exposure that would catch the winter sun. On the 5th day, he started digging. "What in God's name is he doing up there?" Josiah Mercer asked, squinting up the ridge toward where a lone figure worked with a shovel in the afternoon heat. Josiah ran the livery stable in Broken Creek. He was a quiet man who minded his own business, but even he had grown curious about the stranger on the North Ridge. For 3 weeks now, that man had been digging, not a well, not a root cellar, something else, something that made no sense from a distance. "Building himself a grave," Bickle said with a snort, "digging it nice and deep so the wolves do not get him." The men on the general store porch laughed. "I heard he's from Philadelphia," said Tom Creedy, who did odd jobs around the settlement when his drinking allowed. "Some kind of educated man. Read books and such." "Books," Bickle repeated, loading the word with contempt. "Books will not keep a man warm when January comes. Books will not stop his pipes from freezing or his fire from dying at 3 in the morning when the wind cuts through every crack in his walls. That fool up there thinks he knows better than the rest of us because he read about frontier living in some fancy library. But there is a difference between reading about cold and feeling cold. He will learn. They always learn. The digging continued through June and into July. By now, several settlers had made the climb up to the North Ridge to see for themselves what Elias Croft was doing. They found him sunburned and stripped to the waist, standing in a trench that ran the entire length of what would become his cabin floor. The trench measured 2 feet wide and 2 feet deep, and it stretched 47 feet from end to end in a serpentine pattern that doubled back on itself 3 times. "You building a castle or a coffin?" one visitor asked. Elias wiped the sweat from his face. "I am building a heating system." "A what?" "The Romans called it a hippocaust. The Koreans call it ondol. The principle is simple. Instead of heating the air inside a room, you heat the floor. Warm air rises, so a heated floor warms the entire space from the bottom up. More efficient, more consistent, and the mass of the floor holds heat long after the fire source dies." The visitor stared at the trench. "You're going to heat rocks." "Stone, yes. Specifically, I'm going to run smoke through a channel beneath the floor. The smoke will surrender its heat to the stones that line the channel and the stones that form the floor above it. By the time the smoke exits through the far chimney, it will have lost most of its thermal energy to the surrounding mass. That mass will then radiate heat upward into the living space. A properly designed system should maintain comfortable temperatures with a fraction of the fuel required by a traditional fireplace." The visitor was quiet for a long moment. Then he laughed. "You are going to run smoke under your floor? Through a ditch? And that is going to keep you warm?" "Yes." "Friend, that is the strangest thing I have ever heard. Smoke goes up chimneys. Everyone knows that. You start running smoke sideways through holes in the ground, you will fill your cabin with poison and choke to death in your sleep. The chimney at the exit point creates a draft that pulls the smoke through the channel. The system is entirely sealed. No smoke enters the living space." "If you say so." The visitor shook his head. "I'll tell the boys about this. They will want to hear it." He told the boys. The boys spread the word. By the end of July, Elias Croft and his smoke ditch had become the favorite joke of Broken Creek. "Heard he is lining it with river rock now," Creedy reported one evening at the general store, carrying stones up from the creek bed one at a time like some kind of ant. "The creek bed," Bickle repeated. "Those stones are round, smooth. They will not stack worth a damn. Has this fool never built a wall in his life?" "He is not building a wall. He is building a, what did he call it? A flue, an underground flue." Bickle shook his head. "An underground flue. An educated fool from Philadelphia is going to show us mountain men how to stay warm. That is rich. That is truly rich. How much do you want to bet he comes crawling down here before Christmas, begging for a spot by someone else's fire?" "I will take that bet," said Mercer quietly. $5 says he makes it to spring." Everyone turned to look at the liveryman. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it usually meant something. "You think that smoke ditch is going to work?" Bickle demanded. "I think that man knows something we do not. I think a man does not dig for 3 months in the hot sun unless he believes in what he is doing. And I think we have all seen stranger things work than running smoke through rocks." Bickle's face darkened. He did not like being challenged, especially not by a man who worked with horses and manure for a living. $10. $10 says he freezes out before New Year." Mercer met his eyes. $10 it is. The stone work began in August. Elias had spent his evenings through July splitting firewood for the coming winter, and he had accumulated a pile that his neighbors found almost as amusing as his trench. The pile stood 8 feet tall and 20 feet long, neatly stacked in rows of split logs that looked enough to last 3 winters rather than one. What they did not understand was that Elias planned to burn most of that wood during construction, not during winter. The smoke tunnel required heat to cure properly. The mortar between the stones needed to dry slowly over weeks, not days, to achieve full strength. And the floor stones themselves needed to be heated and cooled repeatedly to reveal any cracks or weaknesses before the snow came. He worked alone. Bickle had made sure of that. The word had gone out through the settlement. Anyone who helped the fool on the North Ridge would find their credit terms suddenly less favorable. No one in Broken Creek could afford to anger the man who controlled the supplies. So Elias mixed his own mortar. He laid his own stones. He built his own forms and leveled his own grades and checked his own angles with instruments he had brought from Philadelphia. The work moved slowly, but it moved. The channel took shape first. Flat stones formed the floor, tilted slightly downward from the fire pit end toward the exhaust end to encourage proper smoke flow. Larger stones formed the walls, mortared in place, and checked for gaps that might leak smoke into the surrounding earth. Flat capstones would eventually cover the channel, and above those capstones a layer of sand and clay would support the final floor surface. The system worked like a covered trough, a controlled pathway that would guide smoke from one end of the cabin to the other while forcing it to surrender heat along the way. "The key is mass," Elias explained to Mercer, who had taken to visiting the construction site once a week. The liveryman never offered to help. He knew what that help would cost him. But he watched, and he asked questions, and he listened to answers that gradually began to make sense. Mass? Thermal mass, the capacity of a material to absorb and store heat. Stone has excellent thermal mass. It heats slowly, but it also cools slowly. A large stone heated to 200 degrees will radiate warmth for hours after the heat source is removed. My channel is lined with approximately 9,000 pounds of river stone. The floor above it will add another 6,000 pounds. That is 15,000 pounds of thermal mass absorbing heat from the smoke that passes through the system. Even a small fire can heat that mass over the course of a day, and that mass will then release that stored heat throughout the night. Mercer frowned. But how does the smoke travel through without filling the cabin? Draft. The exhaust chimney at the far end of the channel is taller than the fire pit opening at the near end. Hot air rises. As the smoke enters the channel, it naturally wants to rise toward the highest point. The only path upward is through the channel and out the far chimney. The system pulls itself. I never need to force the smoke. I simply start a fire and physics does the rest. And the smoke never leaks? If the system is properly sealed, no. The mortar between the stones creates an airtight pathway. Any leak would be visible during the curing process because smoke would escape from the gap. I have heated the system 4 times now and found 3 leaks. I repaired each one. The next heating should confirm the seal. September brought the walls. Elias had spent what remained of his cash reserves on milled lumber from Bickle's operation, paying double the fair price because he had no choice. Bickle had smiled when he took the money, and his smile had widened when Elias carried the lumber up the ridge board by board on his own back. But the smile faded slightly when the walls went up in less than 2 weeks. The educated fool from Philadelphia, it turned out, knew how to frame a structure. His corners were square. His walls were plumb. His roof beams sat level and true. Whatever else he was, the man was not incompetent with tools. The cabin measured 24 feet by 18 feet, large by Broken Creek standards. Most settlers built small to conserve heat, cramming their families into single rooms that barely fit a bed and a table. Elias built large because his heating system would allow it. The entire floor served as a radiator. The entire space would stay warm. He did not need to huddle around a single fireplace, fighting for position closest to the flames. October brought the floor. This was the most critical work, the final layer that would determine whether everything beneath it functioned properly. Elias laid flagstones one by one over the sand and clay bed, checking each stone for flatness and stability before moving to the next. The stones fit together like a puzzle, their edges touching but not quite meeting, small gaps left intentionally to allow heat to radiate upward through the joints. A solid floor would trap the heat below. A gapped floor would channel it into the living space. "When will you know if it works?" Mercer asked on his final visit before winter. Elias stood in the center of his cabin, surrounded by stone and wood and the smell of fresh mortar. The fire pit sat at the north end, a simple brick-lined depression where flames would send their smoke into the channel below. The exhaust chimney rose at the south end, a stone column that climbed 8 feet above the roofline to maximize draft. Between those 2 points, invisible beneath his feet, ran the serpentine pathway that had consumed his entire summer. "I will know the first night the temperature drops below freezing," he said. "If the system works, the floor will stay warm. If it does not work, the floor will crack from uneven heating, or smoke will leak into the living space, or the draft will fail and the fire will choke on its own exhaust. There are many ways for this to fail. There is only one way for it to succeed." "And if it fails?" Elias allowed himself a small, grim smile. "Then Bickle wins his bet and you owe him $10. The first snow fell on November 3rd. Elias woke that morning to a world transformed, the ridge blanketed in white, the trees bowed under the weight of fresh powder, the air sharp with the smell of winter. He pulled on his boots and walked to the fire pit, where the previous night's flames had died to coals. He added kindling. He added logs. He built the fire slowly, carefully, watching the smoke curl upward from the flames and then vanish into the channel opening as the draft took hold. He waited. The stones were cold. They had been cold all night, and they would stay cold for hours yet while the system absorbed the fire's heat. This was the hardest part, the hours between starting a fire and feeling its effects. A traditional fireplace offered immediate warmth, flames you could see and feel the moment they caught. The smoke tunnel offered nothing immediate. It demanded patience. It demanded faith. It demanded that a man trust the physics he had read about in books and bet his life on principles he could not see working. By noon, the exhaust chimney was warm to the touch. By mid-afternoon, the floor stones near the fire pit end had risen to room temperature. By evening, a faint warmth radiated from the entire floor surface, gentle but unmistakable, the first proof that the system functioned as designed. Elias sat on that warm floor with his back against the wall and allowed himself to breathe. He had not frozen to death. He had not filled his cabin with poisoned smoke. He had not cracked his floor or collapsed his channel or done any of the 100 things his neighbors had predicted. He had built something that worked. But one night was not a winter. One fire was not a season. The real test would come when December brought the deep cold, when January brought the endless nights, when February brought the storms that buried settlements and killed the unprepared. His neighbors had laughed at his smoke tunnel. They had bet against his survival, and they were still waiting to collect. The first visitor came on November 17th. She was a woman of perhaps 30 years, with tired eyes and a worn coat, and 2 children clinging to her skirts. Her name was Martha Pruitt, and her husband had died of fever 6 weeks earlier, leaving her alone on a small claim at the south end of the valley. She had heard about the man on the North Ridge and his strange heating system. She had climbed up through the snow to see if any of the rumors were true. "May I come in?" she asked. Elias stepped aside. Martha entered the cabin and stopped. Her eyes moved from wall to wall, taking in the simple furnishings, the small windows, the absence of a traditional fireplace. Then she looked down at the floor. She felt the warmth rising through her boots. She knelt and placed her palm flat against the stones. "It is warm," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The floor is warm." "Yes." "How?" Elias explained. He showed her the fire pit, which held only a modest flame. He walked her to the exhaust chimney outside and let her feel the warm air escaping. He knelt beside her on the floor and traced the path of the channel with his finger, describing what lay beneath the stones, how the smoke traveled, how the heat transferred. "And this keeps you warm all night, even after the fire dies?" "The stones hold heat for 6 to 8 hours after the fire goes out, depending on how long and how hot the fire burned. I wake once in the night to add wood. By morning, the floor is still warm enough to walk on barefoot." Martha's children had shed their coats. They sat on the floor playing with a piece of string, their faces relaxed for the first time in weeks. Their mother watched them with something that looked almost like hope. "My cabin is cold," she said quietly. "The chinking has cracked. The fireplace does not draw properly. I burn twice the wood I should, and we still shiver through the night. I thought we would have to leave before Christmas, go back east, give up." She paused. "Could you build one of these for me?" Elias was quiet for a long moment. "It would require digging up your floor, laying stone, curing mortar. The work takes months in warm weather. In winter, it would be nearly impossible." "Then what can I do?" He thought about it. He thought about Bickle and the credit terms and the way the settlement worked. He thought about a woman alone with 2 children facing a winter that had already killed stronger people than her. And he thought about the satisfaction of proving not just that his system worked, but that it mattered. "Your fireplace," he said. "Tell me about it." Martha described her cabin, her chimney, the way smoke sometimes poured back into the room when the wind shifted. Elias listened, asked questions, drew sketches on a scrap of paper. After an hour, he had a list of repairs that would not require a new heating system, just a better understanding of the old one. A higher chimney, a narrower throat, proper chinking with a sand and clay mixture that would flex without cracking, small changes that would make a large difference. "I can help you with these repairs," he said, "but I will need materials, some from your land, some from the store. That means dealing with Bickle." Martha's face tightened. "I already owe him for my husband's burial. He holds the note on our claim. If I ask for more credit, he will own everything we have." "Then we will find another way." He sent her home with detailed instructions and a promise to visit her claim the following week. When she was gone, Elias stood alone in his warm cabin and understood for the first time that survival in Broken Creek was not about outlasting the cold. It was about outlasting the man who wanted everyone to fail. And that was a battle he had not yet begun to fight. The word spread. The fool on the North Ridge had heated his floor with smoke. The fool was not freezing. The fool was walking around barefoot while everyone else layered blankets on top of blankets and huddled around their fireplaces, burning through their wood supplies twice as fast as they had planned. Bickle heard the word and did not like it. "Smoke tunnels," he said, spitting the phrase like a curse. "Heated floors. What kind of nonsense is this? A fire heats a room. Everyone knows that. A fire does not heat rocks under your feet like some kind of witchcraft." But the reports kept coming. Creedy had visited and felt the floor himself. Mercer confirmed that the system worked exactly as Elias had described. Even some of Bickle's own men admitted that the cabin on the North Ridge stayed warmer than any building in the valley, despite burning less wood than a cook stove. I want that claim, Bickle said one evening after the store had closed and only his closest associates remained. I want that man gone, and I want whatever he built up there. He paid cash, one of his men reminded him. He owes nothing. You got no hold on him. Then I will find one. December brought the first real test. A storm rolled in from the mountains on the 8th and did not leave for 4 days. The snow fell in sheets, driven sideways by wind, that found every gap and crack and weakness in every structure in the valley. Temperatures dropped to 10 below zero, then 20 below. Then, on the third night, 30 below, cold enough to freeze a man's lungs if he breathed too deeply. Elias kept his fire burning, not a roaring blaze, just a steady flame that fed smoke into his channel and heat into his floor. He checked his exhaust chimney every few hours, clearing the snow that tried to block it, ensuring the draft continued to pull. He monitored the floor temperature with a thermometer he had brought from Philadelphia, recording numbers in his notebook that would have seemed impossible to anyone watching. The floor surface stayed at 64 degrees. The air temperature stayed at 62 degrees. The fire consumed 4 logs over 8 hours, roughly 1/4 the fuel a traditional fireplace would have required to maintain similar warmth. On the 5th day, when the storm finally broke, Elias opened his door and looked out at a valley buried under white. Nothing moved. No smoke rose from the chimneys below. For a long moment he feared the worst. Then, one by one, doors began to open. Figures emerged into the pale morning light, stamping their feet and blowing into their hands and squinting up at the ridge where the strange man lived. They had survived, barely, but they had survived. Martha Pruitt's cabin had survived as well. The repairs Elias had helped her make before the storm had held. Her chimney had drawn properly. Her chinking had kept out the wind. She had burned too much wood, more than she could afford to replace, but she and her children were alive. When she climbed to the ridge to thank him, she found Elias outside in shirt sleeves, clearing snow from his entrance as if the worst storm in a generation had been nothing more than an inconvenience. "How?" she asked. "How are you not frozen?" He invited her inside. He showed her the thermometer. He explained that his fire had never gone out, that the floor had never dropped below 60 degrees, that he had slept through nights that should have killed him wrapped in a single blanket on the warm stones. "This is not possible," she said. "It is physics, the same physics that makes a hot stone stay warm after you remove it from a fire, the same physics that makes a cast iron pan hold heat long after you take it off the stove. I've simply applied those principles on a larger scale." Martha looked at him with something that went beyond gratitude, something that looked almost like awe. "You have to teach us. You have to teach everyone. This could save lives." "I know." "Then why have you not?" Elias was quiet for a moment. He walked to the window and looked down at the valley below, at the settlement where Bickle ruled through credit and fear, where knowledge was hoarded and shared only at a price. "Because there are people who do not want everyone to survive," he said. "There are people who profit from desperation, and those people will fight very hard to make sure that what I have built here never spreads beyond this ridge." The confrontation came 2 days before Christmas. Bickle rode up the ridge with 3 men behind him. They carried rifles. They did not smile. The snow crunched beneath their horses' hooves as they approached the cabin where smoke rose thin and steady from a chimney that stood apart from the main structure. Elias met them at his door. "Mr. Croft," Bickle said, not dismounting, "we need to have a conversation about your activities in this settlement." "I was not aware I required your permission to live on my own land." "You do not require my permission, But you do require my goodwill, and lately you have been testing that goodwill." Elias said nothing. "I have heard reports," Bickle continued, "reports that you have been visiting the Pruitt widow, reports that you have been offering advice, technical advice, advice that might make certain people think they do not need certain services I provide." "I helped a woman repair her chimney. I did not realize that was a crime." "It is not a crime, but it is an interference. You see, Mr. Croft, this settlement runs on a certain understanding. People need things. I provide those things. In exchange, they pay me, sometimes in cash, sometimes in labor, sometimes in land. The system works. It has worked for 8 years, and I do not appreciate outsiders coming in and disrupting what works." One of the men behind Bickle shifted his rifle. The barrel caught the winter light. Elias looked at the rifle, then at the man holding it, then back at Bickle. "What exactly do you want?" "I want you to stop. Stop visiting the other settlers. Stop sharing. Whatever ideas you have rattling around in that educated head of yours. Stop making people think there might be ways to survive out here that do not involve my store, my mill, my credit terms. Do that, and we will have no problems. Refuse, and well." Bickle smiled. "Winter is long. Accidents happen. A man alone on a ridge could slip on the ice, could fall in the creek, could have his woodpile catch fire in the middle of the night. Terrible things. Accidents." The threat hung in the air like frost. Elias understood what he was facing. This was not a negotiation. This was not a business arrangement. This was the raw exercise of power by a man who had built his entire position on the desperation of others. Bickle needed people to fail. He needed them cold and hungry and afraid, because fear made them compliant, and compliance made them profitable. A man who could heat his home with half the wood, who could survive without credit, who could help others do the same. That man was not just a threat to Bickle's income. He was a threat to Bickle's existence. "I understand," Elias said. Bickle's smile widened. "Good. I knew you were a reasonable man. Educated men usually are. They understand how the world works." "I understand how your world works, but I did not come here to live in your world, Mr. Bickle. I came here to build my own." The smile vanished. "And I will continue to help anyone who asks for my help," Elias continued. "I will share what I know with anyone who wants to learn. And if you or your men set foot on my property again with threats and rifles, I will defend myself with whatever means necessary." "That is not a threat, Mr. Bickle. That is a statement of fact." For a long moment, no one moved. The wind picked up, swirling snow around the horse's legs. One of the animals stamped and snorted, breath steaming in the cold air. Then Bickle laughed. It was a cold sound, sharp as the wind. "You are a fool, Croft. A fool who does not understand what kind of country this is. Out here there is no law, no sheriff, no judge. There is only power, and I have it, and you do not. Remember that when the snow gets deeper and the nights get longer. Remember that when you are lying awake wondering if tonight is the night your cabin burns." He turned his horse and rode back down the ridge. His men followed. Elias watched them go until they disappeared into the tree line, and then he went back inside and sat on his warm floor and tried to figure out how to fight a war he had never wanted. The first strike came on New Year's Eve. Elias woke to the smell of smoke, not the clean smoke of his heating system, which carried a faint scent of burning pine. This was different. This was acrid and chemical and wrong. He rolled off his sleeping pallet and crossed to the door in 3 steps. His woodpile was burning. The flames had already consumed half of it. Someone had doused the wood with kerosene and set it alight, and the fire was spreading. Fast, climbing through the stacked logs like a living thing hungry for more. Elias grabbed his buckets and ran for the creek, but he knew even as he ran that it was hopeless. The creek was frozen over. The snow was too far away. By the time he could gather enough to make a difference, the fire would have taken everything. He fought anyway. He shoveled snow onto the flames. He kicked burning logs away from the rest of the pile. He worked until his hands blistered and his lungs ached from the smoke and the cold. When the fire finally died, not because he had beaten it, but because it had run out of fuel, he stood in the ashes and counted what remained. 40 logs, maybe 50. He had started the winter with over 300. The sun rose on a new year, and Elias Croft looked at the ruins of his preparations and understood that Bickle had just tried to kill him, not with a rifle, not with a knife, with cold, with the simple, brutal mathematics of winter. A man needed fuel to survive. Take away the fuel, and the man dies. Clean, simple, untraceable. Just another fool who had underestimated the frontier. But Bickle had made a mistake. He had assumed that Elias needed as much wood as everyone else. He had not understood that the smoke tunnel changed the equation. He had not done the calculations. Elias went back inside. He sat at a small table with his notebook and his pencil, and he did the calculations himself. 50 logs. Average burn time of 4 hours each in his system. 200 hours of fire. At 6 hours of fire per day, that gave him roughly 33 days of heat. It was now January 1st. February would end in 59 days. He was 26 days short. He needed more fuel. The solution came to him 3 days later while he was walking his property looking for anything that could burn. He had already stripped the dead branches from every tree within easy reach. He had already collected the fallen limbs half buried in snow. He had even considered tearing down his own outhouse for fuel, though he had rejected that idea as too desperate too soon. Then he saw the coal. It was not much, just a seam of black running through a granite outcrop near the northern boundary of his claim. He had noticed it during his initial survey, but had dismissed it as worthless. Coal required mining. Mining required equipment. Equipment required money he no longer had. But coal also burned hotter than wood, and hotter meant more heat transferred to the stones, and more heat transferred meant less fuel needed overall. He spent the next week extracting what he could with nothing but a pickaxe and determination. The seam was thin, barely a foot wide, and it ran only 20 feet before disappearing into solid rock. But 20 feet of coal, even a narrow seam, represented hundreds of pounds of fuel. He broke it out chunk by chunk, carried it back to his cabin in sacks, and stored it in the corner where his woodpile had once stood. The first coal fire changed everything. Wood smoke traveled through his tunnel at roughly 400 degrees. Coal smoke traveled at over 600. The difference was dramatic. Within 2 hours of lighting his first coal fire, the floor temperature had risen from 62 degrees to 71 degrees. The stones were almost hot to the touch. The cabin felt like a summer afternoon, but the heat came with a problem. Coal smoke was dirtier than wood smoke. It left deposits on the channel walls that could eventually restrict airflow. And coal burned differently, requiring more careful air management to prevent the fire from smothering itself. Elias adapted. He mixed coal with wood, using the cleaner fuel to flush the system after periods of coal burning. He adjusted his fire pit design, adding a raised grate that allowed better air circulation beneath the burning fuel. He experimented with different ratios, tracking temperatures and burn times and smoke density in his notebook until he found the optimal combination. 3 parts wood to 1 part coal. Burn coal during the day when the fire could be monitored. Switch to wood at night for a slower, cleaner burn. The hybrid approach stretched his fuel supply while maintaining the floor temperatures he needed. By the end of January, He had burned through half his remaining resources. By mid-February, he was down to his last 20 logs and 50 pounds of coal, and then the real storm hit. The settlers of Broken Creek would talk about the storm of February 1853 for the rest of their lives. It arrived on the 15th without warning, a wall of white that descended from the mountains like the wrath of an angry god. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. The wind rose to speeds that tore shingles from roofs and knocked men off their feet. The snow fell so thick and fast that a man could not see his own hand in front of his face. The storm lasted 9 days. Elias rationed his fuel with mathematical precision: 2 logs in the morning, 1 scoop of coal at midday, 2 logs in the evening, no fire overnight, just the stored heat of the floor stones carrying him through the dark hours. He slept fully clothed with every blanket he owned piled on top of him. He ate cold food because he could not spare fuel for cooking. He melted snow for drinking water by holding it against the warm stones in containers that heated slowly, degree by degree. On the 4th day, his last log went into the fire. On the 5th day, his last coal followed. On the 6th day, he sat on his cooling floor and watched the temperature drop from 58 degrees to 52 degrees to 47 degrees. The wind outside screamed like a wounded animal. The snow piled against his walls in drifts that reached the windows. And Elias Croft, the educated fool from Philadelphia who had come west to prove a theory, faced the very real possibility that he was going to freeze to death. He thought about his life, about the choices that had brought him here, about the wife who had died of cholera 5 years ago, leaving him alone with nothing but his books and his ideas, about the lecture halls where men in fine suits had laughed at his drawings and dismissed his theories as impractical fantasy, about the night he had decided to sell everything he owned and travel 3,000 miles to prove those men wrong. He thought about Bickle, sitting warm in his store, waiting for word that the fool on the North Ridge had finally perished, waiting to claim the land, the cabin, the system that had kept a man alive through the worst winter in memory, waiting to win. And then, because he was not the kind of man who gave up, Elias started thinking about solutions. The floor stones held heat. That was the principle, but heat could come from any source, not just fire. What else generated heat? What else could warm rocks? Bodies. Bodies generated heat. A human body at rest produced roughly 100 watts of thermal energy, most of it radiated outward through the skin. That energy usually dissipated into the surrounding air, wasted. But what if it could be captured? What if a body in direct contact with a thermal mass could transfer that heat into the mass, instead of losing it to the air? Elias stripped off his clothes, all of them. He lay face down on the floor stones, pressing as much of his skin against the surface as possible. The stones were cold, colder than his body by 15 degrees, and the shock of contact made him gasp, but he held the position. He forced himself to stay still while his body heat flowed out of him and into the floor. After 10 minutes, the stones beneath him felt warmer. After 30 minutes, he could feel his own warmth radiating back at him. After an hour, the area directly beneath his body had risen 3 degrees. It was not enough. It was nowhere near enough to heat the entire floor. But it was proof that the principle worked. Heat could be transferred in either direction. The question was how to generate enough heat without fuel. He thought about it for the rest of the day. He thought about it through the night, shivering under his blankets on stones that slowly surrendered the last of their warmth. He thought about it until, sometime in the gray hours before dawn on the 7th day, an idea arrived that was either brilliant or insane. The other settlers had fuel. They had to. Bickle would have made sure of that, because Bickle needed customers alive to pay their debts. If Elias could reach them, If he could trade something for wood, he might survive. But what did he have to trade? Knowledge. He had knowledge. He had the only working smoke tunnel heating system in 300 miles. He had the skills to build another one, and another after that. He had something that could change how every settler in the valley survived every winter for the rest of their lives. The storm broke on the 8th day. The wind died. The snow stopped falling. The sun appeared through the clouds like a promise of better times. Elias Croft pulled on every piece of clothing he owned. He wrapped his feet in rags to fit inside his boots. He stuffed his coat with dried grass for insulation, and he opened his door and stepped out into a world buried under 6 feet of snow. The walk down to the valley took 4 hours. He fell through drifts that swallowed him to the chest. He crawled over ice that sliced his hands through his gloves. He pushed through exhaustion and cold and the absolute certainty that he would die in the snow and no one would find his body until spring. But he made it. Martha Pruitt saw him first. She was outside her cabin clearing snow from her door when a figure appeared on the ridge trail, moving slow and unsteady like a man walking in a dream. She called for help. She ran toward him. She caught him as he fell. "I need fuel," he said, the words coming out in a croak. "I can pay. I can teach. I can build what I built for anyone who helps me." Word spread. Within an hour, half the settlement had gathered at Martha's cabin, staring at the half-frozen man who had walked through a blizzard to ask for help. Within 2 hours, the debate had begun. "He has nothing," Bickle said. He had arrived as soon as he heard, pushing his way to the front of the crowd. "He burned through his wood months ago. That fire was no accident. I know all of you are low on fuel. I know some of you are rationing already. Why would you give what little you have to a man who cannot help himself?" "Because he can help us," Martha said. She stood beside Elias, one hand on his shoulder. "His floor stays warm all night. His cabin uses half the wood ours do. He knows things, Horace, things that could save lives." "He knows nothing. He is a fool with a hole in the ground." "That hole kept him alive through December, through January, through most of this storm. How many of us can say the same?" The crowd murmured. Bickle heard doubt in that murmur, and doubt was dangerous. "Fine," he said, his voice hard. "You want to save him? Save him. But remember who keeps this settlement running. Remember who extended credit when your crops failed. Remember who will be here long after this educated fool has frozen or starved or given up and gone back east." He turned to go, then stopped. "And remember that anyone who helps him will find their terms with me suddenly less favorable." The crowd fell silent. Bickle's threat hung over them like a blade. Then Josiah Mercer stepped forward. "I will give him 10 logs, the liveryman said. "I have enough to spare, and I do not care about your terms, Horace. I never have." "Josiah, you owe me $10 from our bet. I say Croft survives the winter, and he has. Pay up or shut up." Bickle's face went red, then white, then something darker. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a handful of coins, and threw them at Mercer's feet. "There is your money. You can burn it for warmth when this fool drags you down with him." He pushed through the crowd and was gone. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Martha knelt and picked up the coins, one by one, and pressed them into Mercer's hand. "Thank you, Josiah." Mercer looked at the coins, then at Elias, then at the crowd. "I cannot build what he built. None of us can, not without learning how. But we can keep him alive long enough to teach us." He turned to face the other settlers. "Who else has wood to spare? Not charity, investment. We keep this man breathing through February, and come spring, he shows us how to never fear winter again. That is the deal. Who is in?" Hands went up. Not everyone. Not even half. But enough. Enough logs promised to stretch Elias through the end of the storm season. Enough trust offered to give him a chance. They carried him back up the ridge 3 days later, when he had recovered enough strength to guide them. They brought their fuel, contributions on sleds, and in sacks, and balanced on shoulders. They entered his cabin one by one and felt the floor that had stayed warm, even after days without fire, the stones that still held a trace of heat from their last burning. 64 degrees, Elias said, reading his thermometer. The floor dropped to 38 degrees during the storm, the coldest it has ever been. But it never reached freezing. The mass held enough residual heat to stay above the frost line. If I had kept even a small fire burning, even for a few hours a day, it would never have dropped below 50. The settlers listened. They asked questions. They touched the stones and studied the fire pit, and walked outside to examine the exhaust chimney. And slowly, they began to understand what Elias had built. "How long to build one of these?" Mercer asked. 3 months minimum for a proper installation. The channel must be dug. The stones must be laid and mortared. The mortar must cure. The floor must be installed. Each step takes time. So we cannot do it before next winter. You cannot do it this spring, but you could do it this summer. Work through June, July, August. Cure the systems in September. Be ready by October. Elias looked at the faces around him. "I will teach anyone who wants to learn. I will help anyone who wants to build. No charge, no credit terms, just the promise that you will help others once you understand how it works." "Why?" someone asked. "Why would you give away something this valuable?" Elias thought about the question. He thought about the wife he had lost and the life he had left behind. He thought about the men who had laughed at his theories and the man who had tried to burn him out of existence. And he thought about what he had come west to prove. "Because knowledge is not valuable when it is hoarded," he said. "Knowledge is valuable when it spreads. Every cabin in this valley with a heated floor is proof that my ideas work. Every family that survives next winter because of what I built is evidence that the experts back east were wrong. I did not come here to get rich. I came here to be right. And the more of you who learn this system, the more right I become." Spring came slowly to Broken Creek. The snow melted in stages, first from the valley floor, then from the lower slopes, finally from the ridge where Elias Croft's cabin stood like a monument to stubbornness. As the ground thawed, the work began. 7 families had committed to building smoke tunnels. 7 claims across the valley would be transformed over the summer, their floors torn up and replaced with the same stone-lined channels that had kept Elias alive. He visited each site personally, surveying the terrain, sketching plans, calculating dimensions. Each system had to be custom designed for its building. The channel length depended on the floor area. The stone selection depended on what was locally available. The fire pit placement depended on the prevailing winds and the natural draft. Martha Pruitt's cabin was first. Her husband had built on good ground, relatively flat, with excellent drainage. The soil was soft enough to dig without blasting. The creek that ran past her property provided an endless supply of river stones, and she had 2 children old enough to carry rocks and mix mortar, turning a family that had nearly frozen into a workforce that could reshape their future. 18 inches wide, Elias instructed, standing in the trench that would become her channel. 20 inches deep, the stones on the bottom should be flat and stable. The stones on the sides should fit together tight enough that mortar can seal the gaps, no gaps larger than half an inch. Any larger and smoke will find a way through. Martha worked beside him, her hands raw from the labor. "How do you know all of this?" "I read. I studied." I made mistakes and fixed them. He lifted a stone and placed it in position, checking the level before setting it down. The Romans built hippocausts 2,000 years ago. The Koreans have been building ondol systems for at least 1,000. This knowledge exists, it has always existed, but it stays trapped in books that most people never read, in languages that most people cannot understand. I simply translated what the ancients knew into something that works here, now, with the materials we have. And you learned this in Philadelphia? I learned the theory in Philadelphia. I learned the practice here. Theory tells you what should work. Practice tells you what actually works. They are not always the same. The construction continued through May and into June. Elias traveled from site to site, supervising, correcting, teaching. He developed a system for training the settlers, starting with the simplest tasks and building toward the more complex. First, dig the trench. Second, lay the base stones. Third, build the walls. Fourth, apply the mortar. Fifth, install the capstones. Sixth, build the floor. Each step built on the previous one. Each skill learned made the next skill easier. Bickle watched from his store and said nothing. He had lost the battle for public opinion, at least for now. The settlers who were building smoke tunnels talked about their projects constantly, comparing progress, sharing techniques, celebrating small victories. The settlers who were not building watched with growing interest, asking questions, wondering if they should have joined in, but Bickle was patient. He had been patient for 8 years. He could be patient a little longer. The first test came in October. Martha's system had been completed in late August, the mortar cured through September, the floor laid in early October. Her cabin, once a drafty death trap, now featured a 40-foot channel that snaked beneath her living space. Her fire pit sat in the northwest corner. Her exhaust chimney rose from the southeast. The system followed every principle Elias had taught her. The first fire filled the channel with smoke that did not leak. The first night brought floor temperatures of 58 degrees, even though the outside air had dropped to 20. The first week brought the confirmation that Martha and Elias had been hoping for. The system worked. "It works," she said, standing barefoot on her warm floor while her children played nearby. "It actually works." "Of course it works. The physics does not change based on who builds it. The principles are the same whether the system is in my cabin or yours." "But you built it. Your hands. Your knowledge." "You built it. I taught you how. There is a difference." 6 more systems were completed before the first snow fell. 6 more families lit their first fires and felt the warmth rise through their floors. 6 more tests confirmed that the technology was reproducible, that it worked regardless of minor variations in construction, that it delivered exactly what Elias had promised. The winter of 1853 to 1854 was not as harsh as the previous year. The temperatures were milder. The storms were shorter. But the difference in the settlement was impossible to miss. The families with smoke tunnels used half the fuel of the families without. They slept better. They worked better. They complained less about the cold, because there was less cold to complain about. And through it all, Bickle planned. The confrontation came in February, exactly 1 year after Elias had nearly died in his cabin on the ridge. The general store was full. A supply wagon had arrived from Portland with goods that the settlement needed, and Bickle was presiding over the distribution with his usual mixture of false generosity and sharp calculation. Credit was extended, debts were recorded, prices were set just high enough to ensure that no one could ever fully pay off what they owed. Elias entered the store with a list of his own. He needed nails. He needed rope. He needed a new axe head to replace the one that had cracked during the fall construction season. He had cash, not much but enough, and he expected to pay full price because Bickle would never give him a discount. Mr. Croft, Bickle said, his voice carrying across the crowded room. What a surprise! I thought you had decided to become self-sufficient up there on your ridge. Self-sufficient in heat, not in hardware. Ah, yes, your famous heating system. I have heard so much about it. Tell me, how does it feel to have given away the only thing of value you ever created? The room went quiet. I have not given anything away, Elias said. I have shared knowledge. There is a difference. Is there? Because from where I stand, it looks like you spent a year building something valuable and then handed it to your competitors for free. Every family with one of your smoke ditches is a family that buys less wood from me. Every warm cabin is a cabin that does not need my credit to survive the winter. You have cost me money, Mr. Croft. Real money. And what have you gained in return? Elias looked around the room at the faces watching this exchange. Settlers who had built systems. Settlers who had not. Settlers who still owed Bickle more than they could ever repay. I have gained neighbors who will not freeze to death, he said. I have gained a settlement that can survive without depending on one man's generosity. I have gained proof that my ideas work. That seems like a fair trade to me. Bickle's smile was thin and cold. Proof, ideas. You educated men love your abstractions. But let me tell you what I have gained, Mr. Croft. I have gained patience. I have watched you play the hero for a year now, saving the poor settlers from the big bad storekeeper. But heroes have a way of falling. They make mistakes. They overreach. And when they do, I will be there. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only Elias could hear. I have been talking to the territory office, asking questions about land claims. It seems that some claims in this valley were not properly registered. Some surveys were not properly conducted. Some boundaries may have been drawn in the wrong places. He smiled. Your claim, for example. I wonder what a proper survey might reveal. The threat was clear. Bickle was going to challenge the legality of Elias's land ownership. He was going to use bureaucracy as a weapon, lawyers, soldiers, paperwork as ammunition. Even if Elias won in the end, the fight would consume everything he had: time, money, energy, peace of mind. Elias understood that this was the moment. This was the final battle that everything else had been building toward. Not a storm, not a fire, not a physical threat, a legal one. The kind of threat that could not be overcome with knowledge or determination or warm floors. The kind of threat that required something he did not have: allies with power. He looked at Bickle and saw a man who had spent 8 years constructing a system of control as sophisticated as any heating system. Credit extended to create dependency. Prices set to prevent independence. Relationships cultivated to ensure loyalty. Threats delivered to enforce compliance. Bickle had built his empire the same way Elias had built his tunnel, stone by stone, connection by connection, until the whole structure functioned as a single machine designed to achieve a single goal. But every machine had weaknesses. Every system had failure points, and Elias had spent his entire life learning how to find them. Do what you need to do, he said quietly. Challenge my claim. Bring in your lawyers. File your paperwork. But remember something, Mr. Bickle. You built your power on desperation. You need people to be cold and hungry and afraid. But I've spent the last year making them warm. I've spent the last year making them capable. I've spent the last year making them believe that they can survive without you. He raised his voice so the entire room could hear. And if you take my claim, if you drive me out, if you destroy everything I have built, I will have already won. Because the knowledge is not in my cabin. The knowledge is in their heads. In Martha's head. in Mercer's head, in every person who watched me build that tunnel and learned how it works. You cannot take that. You cannot burn that. You cannot bury that in legal paperwork. It is already out there, spreading, growing, becoming something you will never control. The room was silent. Bickle's face had gone white. You think you have won, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You think you have beaten me. But I've been here 8 years. I will be here 8 more. And long after you are gone, I will still be standing in this store, collecting what is owed, extending what is needed, running this valley the way it has always been run. Maybe, Elias said. Or maybe not. I guess we will find out. He turned and walked out of the store, leaving his shopping list behind. He did not need nails. He did not need rope. He did not need anything Bickle had to offer. He had already gotten what he came for, the certain knowledge that his enemy was afraid. The legal challenge came in March. A surveyor arrived from Portland with maps and instruments and a writ from the Territory Office demanding a review of all claims along the North Ridge. Bickle stood beside him smiling, already counting the acres he would gain when the review found irregularities in Elias's paperwork. The survey took 3 days. On the 4th day, the surveyor delivered his report to a gathering that included Bickle, Elias, and most of the settlement. The claim is valid, he said. The boundaries match the original filing. The survey markers are in the correct positions. There are no irregularities. Bickle's smile disappeared. That is impossible. I was told there were questions about the original registration. There were questions. They have been answered. The claim is valid. Who answered them? Who confirmed the registration? The surveyor looked uncomfortable. The original surveyor who filed the claim in 1849, he provided additional documentation when the Territory Office contacted him about your inquiry. The original surveyor is dead. He died in 51. His son is alive. His son inherited his records. His son confirmed that the survey was accurate and properly filed. The surveyor paused. His son also asked me to deliver a message to you, Mr. Bickle. He said that some debts can never be collected. He said you would understand what that means. Bickle understood. Everyone understood. The original surveyor had died owing Bickle money. Bickle had tried to collect from the son. The son had refused. And now, years later, the son had found a way to repay that refusal with interest. The crowd began to disperse. Bickle stood alone in the March mud, watching Elias shake hands with Mercer, and accept a hug from Martha, and receive the congratulations of a settlement that had finally found someone worth believing in. It was not the ending Bickle had imagined, but it was the ending he deserved. The summer of 1854 brought 37 new smoke tunnels to the valley. Settlers came from as far as 50 miles away to learn the technique, and they carried the knowledge back to their own communities. By the end of the decade, the heated floor system had spread across the territory, adapted and modified for different climates and different materials, but always built on the same fundamental principle: heat the mass, and the mass will heat the space. Elias Croft never became rich. He never sought public recognition. He continued to live in his cabin on the North Ridge, improving his system year by year, documenting his discoveries in notebooks that would eventually fill an entire shelf. When visitors asked why he did not patent his invention, why he did not charge for his knowledge, why he gave away what others would have sold, he always gave the same answer. A warm cabin is worth more than a cold fortune, and a community that thrives is worth more than a man who profits from its suffering. Horace Bickle's store closed in 1859. His customers had found other ways to survive. His credit terms no longer held the power they once did. He left Broken Creek without saying goodbye to anyone, and no one missed him when he was gone. Martha Pruitt remarried in 1856 to a widower who had come west seeking a new life and found it in a valley where the winters were cold, but the floors were warm. Her children grew up strong and healthy, never knowing how close they had come to dying in their first winter without a father. Josiah Mercer kept his horses and his silence and his quiet faith in men who built things that worked. He won his bet with Bickle and spent the money on a dinner for the settlement held in Elias's cabin, where 30 people sat on a heated floor and raised glasses to the fool who had proven them all wrong. And the snow fell every winter, as it always had and always would. But in the cabins of Broken Creek, where the stones held warmth and the smoke traveled through tunnels beneath the floor, the cold was no longer something to fear. It was simply something to survive.